Welcome everybody to this Eurooppa-foorumi panel on economy, future and ground rules. So basically we'll be discussing the future of the EU economy and what kind of new governance or control we might have in the future on fiscal policies and fiscal rules in Europe. And yeah, what is new from a government's view? What will be new in the future? I am Anna Karismo. I work for the Finnish broadcasting company as an economic and EU journalist, and I will be moderating this discussion. We only have 45 minutes, so we'll have to be really concise, to the point. So I will start by introducing our panelists. Here in Turku, we have Mr. Antti Ronkainen, who is a researcher of political economy from the University of Helsinki. Welcome.
Thank you.
And then Ms. Tuuli Koivu, who is the chief economist at Nordea Finland, and she has also worked for the Bank of Finland and in the ECB, European Central Bank. Welcome, Tuuli.
Thank you.
And then remotely through Zoom, we have joining us, we have Mr. Shahin Vallee, who is a senior fellow at German Council on Foreign Relations and director of the Geoeconomics program there. Welcome. And where are you exactly? Are you in Berlin, Paris? Where are you?
Yes, I am in Berlin, and I'm sorry I'm not with you in Finland, but I am in Berlin. Yeah.
But thank you for joining us anyway. It will be interesting to hear your views. So let's get straight to the point. The budgetary discipline in the EU has been put on the shelf and in the pandemic, and it's been agreed that government debt and government deficits are allowed to increase as a result of the crisis. And at the same time, monetary policy is a contentious question, especially in Germany, but also here in Finland a little bit. The ECB owns large stocks of government debt, and also these asset buying programs and the negative interest rates, they are really new in this European economic architecture. So what is your take? I will ask Mr. Vallee first to start, or Shahin to start. What will change after this pandemic? And maybe also because of climate change and the decarbonization, what do you think, how urgent is the change and what exactly should be reviewed?
Well, in fact, we've known for a long time now that the euro area architecture as it is today is an imperfect one, and it's one that needs reform. And we've known that for a long time. We've known for a long time now, for almost 10 years, that the architecture that was agreed with the Maastricht Treaty created an imperfect monetary union. In 2012, you'll remember that European leaders agreed to a report of the four presidents presented by the president of the ECB, the Commission, the Eurogroup, and the European Council, and they agreed to reform profoundly the architecture of the single currency. Very few of the reforms proposed back then in 2012 have been implemented. We've created the embryo of a banking union, but on the fiscal front, we are more or less left with the architecture that we had with the Maastricht Treaty. We've created the ESM, we've created emergency instruments. We have done very little to rethink our fiscal rules, and we have done very little to rethink the role that a centralized fiscal institution could play. And this debate has started again with the COVID crisis, where we were forced to suspend the Stability and Growth Pact for a temporary moment. And we were forced to create a capacity at the European level to issue debt and implement spending. And that's the NGEU, or the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And so the big question is whether these two things, the relaxation of the fiscal rules and the creation of a European centralized fiscal capacity were exceptions, were brief moments of interruptions, or whether they're the beginning of a new framework for the euro area. My point of view is that we have seen over the last 2 decades that the euro area, as it was built by the Maastricht Treaty, is an unstable and imperfect construct, and that we need to think deeply about how we can improve that construct. And I think that requires changing the fiscal rules quite profoundly, or at least opening a debate about these rules, whether they are transparent and democratic enough, whether they allow enough fiscal stabilization, and whether they allow enough public investment, and in particular public investment for the purpose of energy and climate transition. And then there is a second question to ask, is whether the EU as a whole, and the single currency in particular, has enough means, fiscal means, to undertake the policies that it must undertake at the central level. And my view is that here again, the Recovery and Resilience Facility should be something that is made more permanent and that evolves over time towards an instrument that helps finance common goods that the EU and the euro area needs. So these are 2 very bold changes that I'm suggesting, but I think Europe should have this conversation, and I'm sure countries like Finland will play an important role in that discussion.
Thank you, Shahin. And Tuuli, what do you think? Do you think the RRF should be permanent? Is this a beginning, or what's your opinion?
I think Shahin made a very good point about saying that this is a new thing, that we are critical towards the deficit targets and debt targets that comes from the 1990s. Those were never credible, and they are even less credible now after the debt levels are really high. The world has changed in many ways on top of that. During the past 5 years, of course, we faced the pandemic, which has been one of the reasons changing the world. But I would raise also US political situation. We never expected Trump to become a president, and that made probably, I would say, more or less permanent harm to the transatlantic relationship for at least for many, many years. We cannot rely on the US anymore. At the same time, we are facing China, that is becoming bigger and bigger power in the world, and we cannot really rely on the Chinese technology either. So that's one reason why we probably need to have more kind of independent, more sustainable economic development here in the euro area, and also more widely in the EU. And it seems that politicians and also population are more in favor of that kind of common policies. As Shahin put it, I very much agree.
And Antti.
Yes, thank you. I want to add only minor point that I agree that in terms of economic policy there was a paradigmatic shift during the COVID crisis, but the question is that how long it lasts, that it relates to the question of common debt. Personally, I think that it is the question of the crisis, that now we made political decision about fiscal stimulus at the EU level, at the common debt, but politically it would require the change to the treaties, and it's politically very hard to make. So I believe that when the next crisis comes, we will issue new common debt and make fiscal stimulus, but the question about how Europe comes out from the COVID-19 pandemic is the question about the relationship between fiscal and monetary policies. And the European Central Bank has transformed already after the euro crisis, and now the question about the reformation of fiscal policies is the question of reform of Stability and Growth Pact. And we will have that discussion next year after the French and German elections. So the time is coming, and time is start to discuss about reforms of these debt rules. But it defines the relationship between fiscal and monetary policies and the fiscal stance overall fiscal stance of Eurozone after the COVID-19 pandemic.
Here in Finland, this 1,750 billion Next Generation EU or the Recovery Fund has caused a lot of criticism, especially the opposition is against it. And it has been explained that it's only temporary and really exceptional. How feasible is it to believe that the Next Generation EU could be a one-off deal? What do you think, Shahin? Is it even technically possible?
So, you know, I've worked in Brussels for a few years, and I remember European lawyers saying very often that certain things were not possible. And then the next day, the very same lawyers explaining that actually they found a way in the treaty to agree to allow something to happen. So I think we should be a bit more flexible. The real question is whether there is political will to do something. If there is political will to do something, I am convinced that lawyers are creative enough to find a way to do it. And I would actually remind us that, you know, during the crisis, the Euro crisis, there were certain things that we thought was not possible without a treaty change, and that therefore they were not possible at all because the treaty change was not possible. And in fact, we did change the treaty. We tend to forget it, but the creation of the ESM actually required an amendment to the treaty. And it was an amendment that was unanimously ratified by the member states. It went through by a simplified procedure that did not require referendums, but it did happen. So to answer your question, it is quite possible indeed that to make the recovery fund permanent, we would need to change the treaty. Whether it would require a comprehensive change of the treaty or a surgical change of the treaty, I think is for lawyers to decide. But I think we've come to a point in any case where reforms of the treaty have to be contemplated. And it's a project that will, you know, maybe take 10 years. But I think it's a process that we should be a bit more open about. And the same goes for the fiscal rules. The fiscal rules that, you know, we call the Stability and Growth Pact are in fact a combination of national, European, intergovernmental, and treaty-based rules. So if we want to change the fiscal rules, it will also probably take a decade. It can first take place through interpretative changes by the Commission. So the Commission can change the way it interprets the rules, and that doesn't need legislative changes that can be done tomorrow. This has already happened. So for instance, the Commission introduced in the past a flexibility clause for investment, and this was done without a legal change. The second step is to do a legislative change. So that takes a while. That has to go through the European Parliament, and that's a process that, you know, could start next year indeed, but would probably take 2 years to complete. The third stage is to remember that we have signed an intergovernmental treaty, the Treaty for Stability, Coordination and Governance, that also brings into national legislation elements of the fiscal rules. So if we wanted to change the fiscal rules deeply, we would probably need to modify or abolish this treaty. And then last but not least, we would also need to change the treaty because, as you know, the fiscal rules, notably the 60% and the 3% are attached to a protocol linked to the treaty. So all I'm saying by going through this motion is to explain that changing Europe's economic governance is probably a decade-long enterprise. But it's not because it's a decade-long enterprise, and it's not because it's a politically difficult enterprise that we should not start. And so what I think is important to realize is that, yes, this is going to be a long and difficult process, but it's also a much needed process. And I don't think we can hide behind the fact that it's legally challenging or politically difficult. I think we have 10 years to explain to the European public that we have built a monetary union that is currently imperfect and unstable, and it is our duty to make it more stable and more perfect, even if it takes a long time.
What about our Finnish economists? What do you think? Is 10 years, isn't it too much, too long? I mean, because we are losing the competition to China and to the US all the time. What do you think? What do you think of this time frame?
Well, I think now we have bought some time with the EU recovery fund and the package, and we have a couple of years. I would also, I think that this time has to be used wisely to develop something new, but I completely agree with Shaheen that the process will be long anyway. But at the same time, I really hope that the countries benefiting most now from the fund would really use the money wisely, because I think that would be like the best advertisement for the whole thing, for the common fiscal rules, for the common fiscal capacity, in order to gain the popularity among populations. If they miss the money, if nothing comes out, if there's no growth, if we just end up with higher debt levels, then I think the public opinion here, for example, in Finland, will be very hard to turn positive towards these ideas.
Yeah, I want to comment what Shaheen said about the time frame. I definitely think that the spirit of the EU's economic constitutional thinking is against common debt and permanent fiscal instruments, and I agree what you said, that it requires only political will, but I think that to create the political acceptance for permanent fiscal instrument for the Eurozone, it might take about 10 years, or at least more than next year when the fiscal rules are reformed. And I have, in my thesis, I'm studying the political transformation of the ECB, and the ECB has transformed after the Euro crisis with legal reinterpretation of the ECB's mandate. For example, the European Constitutional Court has agreed with ECB that it's okay to buy large amount of bonds, and for example, yesterday the chief economist Philip Lane agreed publicly that these large-scale asset purchases reflect the government deficit. So they are more and more openly saying that they are financing directly the euro nations. And the nature of the ECB is different because it doesn't have any democratic responsibility. It's easier to transform monetary policies of the ECB by the back door of the legal reinterpretation. But if you want fiscal transfers to the EU, I definitely think that this transform or development requires political legitimacy, and it isn't possible without treaty changes.
Great, so you agree on this, the treaty change is needed. But then the EU member states disagree on fiscal policy, also monetary policy. For instance, some smaller northern states have already stated that, or expressed that they basically want to return to the old rules and fiscal discipline, whereas, for instance, France, Italy and Spain are for a treaty, want the rules to be renegotiated. So what kind of battle lines do you see here between the member countries? What kind of conflicts will we see in the future? Shaheen, if you start.
I think the point that was made about the ECB is very important. The reality is that now the ECB is also pushing for reforms of the fiscal rules. It is true that the ECB was pushed into doing a lot more during the last 10 years than it was designed to do in the first place. But that is in large part because fiscal authorities were not doing their work. And so these two debates are very much linked. I don't think it is sensible, and that is, I think, the argument of some people. I don't think it is sensible to say that you want both a central bank that does not buy government bonds and that you want a return to strict fiscal rules. I think we have seen that this combination doesn't work. So now you have the choice. Either you basically have a central bank that will underwrite fiscal policy, and that is basically the system we are in now implicitly, or you have a more active fiscal policy that allows basically the monetary policy to return to a more traditional role. And I think we are basically navigating this debate now. How much do we want to change monetary policy, and how much do we want to change fiscal policy? Now to your question about the front line or the fault lines inside Europe around this. Yeah, Italy and France have said, but not very clearly, that they were keen to change fiscal rules. And yes, a number of member states in the north have said that they were rather opposed to it. What I think we're missing to find a bridge between these two positions is how do we want to change the fiscal rules? And I think that debate is weak in large part because the economic consensus around how do we change the fiscal rules is actually weak. Some economists say we need to change the rules on debt and deficit by an expenditure benchmark. Some economists say we should not have rules at all, we should instead have standards. Some economists are arguing that we should just simplify the rules but continue to have a debt and a structural balance target. So the reality is that the economic consensus is very fragile. And I think that is one reason why we struggle to have a political consensus, because the experts, us around the table, do not really agree on what is the way forward. And I think that's a big impediment to agreeing to a new framework. So I think in order to do that, we need to really agree and set the new objectives for these rules. And to me, the objectives that we need to agree on, and then we will agree on how do we achieve these objectives, are one, we need rules that are better at providing stabilization in downturns. And I think what we have seen is that rules that are either anchored on a nominal deficit or debt target, or that are based on an output gap calculation that is unobservable in real time, are rules that are impractical. So I think that's the first objective, be better at providing stabilization. The second objective, I think, is to make sure that fiscal consolidation does not come at the expense of public investment, and in particular of public investment geared towards climate and energy transition. So we need to make sure that our fiscal rules are consistent with our now very ambitious climate and emissions reductions objective. We have nothing today in the rules that are, that ensure that we are leading a policy that is consistent with our climate objectives. That to me is a central second objective. And the third objective is to have rules that are easily understandable by the public so that politicians can be held accountable. Today, the rules are not understandable by the general public, and in reality, they're barely understandable by even economists whose job it is to understand them. So I think that is a big problem. The fact that basically what is called the vademecum, so basically the document that helps you interpret the rules, is a document that is, I think, 170 pages and is only understandable by 2 or 3 people in the European Commission. That is not workable. We cannot build an entire governance and an entire single currency on that basis. So I think if we agree on these 3 objectives, then economists and experts can do the work to decide how we achieve these 3 objectives.
Antti, you laughed. How do you comment?
Yeah, I laughed because I have heard also that this handbook of reinterpreting these rules is over 100 pages long, so it tells about the complexity of the issue. But I agree, and what I said in my first point was that I think that economists agree that the overall economic stance between fiscal and monetary policy is how you say, it's unbalanced, and we need better balance, and the way to get better balance is to get more active fiscal policies, and the question is whether we do it in national level or in European level. And like I have said, I think that it's politically much more harder to get overall more active fiscal capacity to the European level than national level. So I'm very happy that the Commission has started this reform of Growth and Stability Pact, and there are different views. I think that Austria has very hardline position against the reform. They have said practically that the reform should be very non-reform, that we should go back to the original spirit of the Stability and Growth Pact. But I think that there will be a political change also in Germany after the elections, because I think that the atmosphere before the elections is much different than after the elections. It's very probable that the Greens will be the part of coalition, and probably they will get finance ministry. So this will change the Germans' attitude overall to the question of fiscal policies at national level. But everything can happen. If in Germany there will be coalition of CDU, CSU, SPD and FDP, it would be very after that, nothing would change. But I think that this so-called Germany coalition isn't so probable at the time. But combine this point that there might be some political shift in Germany, and combined with what Anna said about France and Italy's attitude, that if Italy, France, and Germany get some kind of compromise, I think that the reform can be politically much more bigger than we assume now.
Tuuli, what do you think? Do you think that Finland, because actually we don't know the Finnish government's position, exact position on these changes yet, but do you think that Finland also needs to be more flexible? Finland has been quite strict on the EU arena on these economic things. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it takes some flexibility from both sides. What has been interesting is that even if my colleagues come from Denmark and Sweden, for example, and when there were these negotiations on the next generation EU, Sweden and Denmark were completely opposite to the idea in the beginning. But then when it was all agreed and the discussion came back to Finland and was rather negative a few months ago, and I asked my colleagues in Denmark, in Sweden, how is the discussion there? They didn't even know that the process was still going on. So there was no any kind of discussion going on. Neither did they knew that their shares of the fund was also getting smaller to better their economic GDP growth rates were. So it was, to my understanding, only here in Finland that was this kind of second round discussion around this. So hopefully this time we'll discuss well in advance, and then we will be in the tables to decide to be kind of progressive, to bring new ideas. I don't like this kind of being wise afterwards. It doesn't help us at all.
Yeah, the German election will be very interesting, but now France and Italy are cooperating more closely than before with Draghi in charge in Italy. What kinds of, or do you think that the power axis of the EU could change with Italy gaining more power, and what kind of effects could that have on fiscal policies in Europe? Shahin?
Yes, so I think having a stronger and finally a more or less stable government in Italy certainly changes the dynamic. Whether it fundamentally changes the potential for change on these very difficult issues, I'm not sure. You know, at the end of the day, these are issues where there needs to be almost unanimous support for us to be able to move forward. So I would rather view the fact that we have a credible government in Italy as something that is reassuring for countries in the north to make some concessions. And in fact, both France and Italy have been, in my view, a bit more timid than I thought they could be in asking for reforms of the fiscal rules. Draghi has not made a speech about that. In fact, he has been more vocal about this when he was president of the European Central Bank than as a prime minister of Italy. And Macron hasn't spoken publicly about this for the moment. He might do it during the French presidential campaign, or he might do it during the French presidency of the EU starting in January 2022. But at the moment, he hasn't made a very strong plea for this. So I would rather than seeing, rather than looking at what's happening in France and Italy as a sign of change, I think the dynamics in Germany are very important. And they're very important because there is an overlap between a European discussion about the evolution of rules and a very national discussion about the fiscal rule in Germany. As you know, Germany has a constitutional debt brake. And in reality, European fiscal rules have been, quite inspired by the evolution of fiscal policy and by this constitutional debt brake. The constitutional debt brake in Germany was introduced in 2009, and the TSCG, the Treaty for Stability, Coordination, Governance, was introduced in 2011, and really inspired by this. So, to me, the real question is whether there will be enough impetus in Germany to also open a conversation about the national debt brake. I find it very hard to imagine that we will have an open discussion about European fiscal rules if there is not a discussion in Germany about the constitutional debt brake. And here I'm a bit worried because, as was said a bit earlier, the political game is very open. There are, at least 3 or 4 possible coalitions that could govern Germany, a month from now. I mean, it's likely to take more than a month because the negotiations of this coalition will take a while. But depending on this coalition and depending on the coalition agreement, there will be space or not to discuss the national debt brake and therefore to discuss the European fiscal rules. So I think more than France and Germany, what really matters in the next month and a half is the result of the German election and then the coalition that will come and that will emerge as a result of that.
Yeah, the US policy has shifted towards stimulus and investments, whereas here in Europe we are like, for instance, in Germany, the focus is still the debt to GDP ratio. Are we missing something? Should we invest more? Are we under-investing at the moment?
We probably are, yes. And I think also the old rules for fiscal policy in the euro area didn't really give incentives or encourage not companies, neither governments to invest. So we should really create a more business-friendly environment here. It's about regulation, it's about taxation, it's about all things together. And that was not really the key area or not targeted at all in the Growth and Stability Pact. So the new rules hopefully are something that give incentives for kind of growth-enhancing policies, both in the public sector and in the private sector, because that is something that we are clearly missing. And to my understanding, the process when for example, going back to the country's budgets in Brussels was very artificial, and it left a lot of loopholes in order to just cut the public investments and nothing else, and then that led to very unstable policies and also lower growth rates. But overall, of course, the discussion around austerity after the euro crisis has changed. We have seen during the past 10 years much higher growth rates in the US than in the euro area. And of course, that has also increased a lot of discussion about economic growth, about the fiscal rules, etc. But I really think that at the moment, we are losing the competition to the US, also to China, to other economic powers in the world. It's not just about public sector. It's also a lot to do with the private sector, but we should really get the whole environment under some sort of reform. It's partly mental, I agree, it's not easily done. We as economists, we don't have any magic trick how to increase economic growth, how to accelerate it. It certainly comes from many small things.
But here Germany is in a key position. Is this, for instance, are there enough investments? Is this a subject in Germany? Is it discussed there? The Germans they save a lot of money by nature, and that shows also in the investments. They don't invest at the moment. So what's the discussion in Germany on this?
I think there is a discussion on investment that has picked up. The fact that we have an SPD finance ministry has helped to have this conversation. But we've had this conversation always short of opening a debate about the debt brake. The Greens, for the first time during this campaign, have openly called for a reform of the debt brake, and have openly called for a minimum, what they call a green rule, so to have a minimum of public sector investment. So the conversation is taking place, but not nearly enough in my view, and I completely agree with what has been said. I think the great danger is that Europe, by not wanting to have a discussion about its fiscal policy, its rules, and its investment, will take the risk of really diverging from other advanced economies, and in particular from the US. I mean, the fact that the US recovery is so strong and the European recovery at the moment is much weaker should be a source of concern and alarm. The great danger is that the US will take a massive lead in new technologies and energy transition, and that Europe will fall behind. And I don't think that this is something that we can afford.
Antti, any comments?
Short comment that I think that if you watch only this debt rule of the Stability of Growth Pact or the debt break in Germany, it's like watching the history and going through the old, already lost battles. And if we watch only these debt rules, we miss the bigger picture, like these under investments. You just yesterday tweeted that investments has not rebounded even in Germany, and that's very worrisome for Europe that they are not rebounding. And the bigger picture about what Tuuli said about private developments. If we, for example, compare to the global unicorns, the startups worth of 1 billion euros. If we watch 20 biggest unicorns, there is only one European firm which comes from Sweden, Klarna. And for example, now China has overtaken United States in international patents, but as well in university degrees. So these kind of developments, researchers are researching, understanding these developments now. But if we watch only the debt rules and the debate about the right amount of public debt, we miss the whole picture about where the Europe is now.
Yeah, then we also have climate change and, for instance, the Fit for 55 proposals, and the EU economic agenda will change, or the transition to carbon neutral economy is bound to have economic implications. And we have only started the discussion on climate change and fiscal policies, how they should interact. What do you think? What will happen in the near future? What kind of discussion will we see on this? Shai?
Yeah, well, I think it's clear, and economists don't say it enough, that climate and energy transition will be a very massive negative productivity shock. It will increase the cost of producing any good. And I think we're actually underestimating the extent to which it will be a negative productivity shock. Of course, it will spur innovation and that will create growth as well. But net, it's a negative productivity shock. And that is why, in order to offset this negative shock, there needs to be quite a bold fiscal expansion to encourage private investment as well, but also to create the public infrastructure that are necessary to facilitate this transition. So I worry very much that we have an economic policy today that is not fit to achieve the climate ambitions that we have set. And that is a big problem. We might be underestimating carbon price, possibly by an order of magnitude. And so that is something that we need to take into account today in the economic policies we put together, and we are not. And it's interesting to look at the US. The US basically doesn't believe, strangely enough, that carbon price is the right instrument to achieve climate and energy transition. There is no national carbon price nor carbon tax in the US. There is only a carbon pricing system in California. And so we have a very interesting system where Europe is investing a lot in its emission trading scheme, thinking that this will be the heart, the engine of the energy and climate transition of the European continent, and that therefore we can afford not to invest as much. And the US is doing exactly the opposite. The US has basically no carbon price and carbon tax, and instead is investing a lot in its energy transition. One of us is making a mistake. Either the US is making a mistake or we are. And my fear is that it is us that is making the mistake.
So investments is the magic word here as well. What do you think, Tuuli? How will this have to be taken into account in fiscal policies?
Well, certainly it has to be taken into account at the European level. It's a global problem, global challenge, but in Europe we need to tackle it at European level to be the most efficient. As Shahim said, it will be a negative productivity shock. It will have negative consequences. It will cost a lot. Not doing it, of course, will cost even much more, so we can't afford that either. But to be efficient on the climate policy, especially now when new technologies are just coming, we need to cut the emissions where it's most efficient. And I think there the EU has a lot to say and a big role to play.
Now, just very briefly, because we have to finish in a moment, how would you summarize, I mean, this whole discussion, in the next 10 years, what will be the considering the climate change and all these pandemic influences that we have, what do you think, what do you wish for, what will happen in 10 years?
I don't know about 10 years, but I want to underline that I think that it's quite possible that during the next 2 years there is political will to reform these fiscal rules. And about the environment, I think that if we just want to slower a little bit global warming, the key is investments to the housing infrastructure and energy policies. So I really hope that when they are reforming the deficit rule, that they take into account the sufficient investments to the slowing down of global warming.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm afraid our time is up. But it was a great interaction. Thank you, Shahin. Also, thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience, and also people who have been following this behind your screens or behind the scenes. And also thank you to the organizers who today were labor and employer organizations From Finland, STTK, SAK, Akava, EK, and then also European Movement Finland. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.